want to look at David this morning. I didn't intend this. It's something that the story that I like, so it fit well for a short notice sermon, but it does fit in well with the topic, which is on men. We did a couple sermons on women and what women can look to in the Bible for direction. Now we wanted to look at a couple lessons on men, and David is an excellent example for us. I want to start over in 1 Samuel chapter 13. David, if you recall, was the second king of Israel. First one was a guy named Saul. People said that they wanted a king. God said, fine, you can have a king. And God chose Saul for them to be king. But Saul didn't turn out so well. Saul had a lot of doubt about himself or something. But he did a couple of things where God told him to do it one way and he did it a different way. Or God said to wait and Saul went ahead and did it anyway, first. And that's what happens here in 1 Samuel chapter 13. The Philistines had come to attack. The Philistines were a people that lived nearby that had a lot better armor and better swords, and there were more of them, and they were better organized, which meant that when they invaded Israel and when the Israelites fought them, the Philistines pretty much always won, which is bad. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Israelites asked for a king, so that they would have a king to lead them into battle, and they thought that would make them win against the Philistines. And that happened. The Philistines came and attacked. Saul called the people together, and they were waiting for. They decided before we go out in battle, we need to have Samuel, who is the priest. We need to have him come and offer sacrifice to God to ask God's blessing on our campaign against the battle that we're going to have. But Samuel took a long time coming. And Saul waited, Saul waited, Saul waited, and Saul waited some more. And all the time that he's waiting, these Israelites, who aren't professional soldiers, these are farmers, different sorts of occupations, not including fighting, who have come in to be his part-time soldiers. And so these soldiers, these militia, look around and they see the Philistines coming and we haven't got God's blessing yet, so maybe I'll just go home and you guys, good luck to you. And people started drifting away. And so Saul takes the muster each morning, and there's fewer people each morning than there were yesterday. And Samuel still hasn't come. Saul's getting nervous. So he decides, okay, fine, we can't let this go on any farther. We've got to get this sacrifice done so we can keep our people. And so Saul decides, I'll go ahead and offer the sacrifice. And of course, no sooner does he finish than Samuel shows up. Samuel says, what are you doing, Saul? That's not your job. That's not your place. You don't have the authority to offer sacrifice. And Saul said, well, people were going away and you hadn't come, and God, we need God's blessing. In verse 12 he says, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, this is in verse 13 of 1 Samuel 13. Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. The Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Samuel makes a prediction to Saul. He says, God's going to replace you. Not with just anybody, but with a man after his own heart. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I'll just give the story away. David, of course, is that man. David is the man who will succeed Saul. David is the man that will be chosen by God. David is the man after God's own heart. So I want to look at what kind of man David was and see how he was a man after his own heart. So men, we want to look at David and see how can we model ourselves after David so that God could call us a man after his own heart. And ladies, you're not left out of this either. The same, well, we'll see. But I think the same qualities about David are qualities that really apply to anyone who wants to follow God, man or woman. To be a man after God's own heart or a woman after God's own heart, we ought to be able to look at David's life and see how and why God chose to call him that. And I want to look at two events out of David's life. So this first part we have, God has said, I'm going to look for a man after my own heart. But it's a while before he actually shows up. Even in the story, it's a while before we actually find him. In chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, God sends Samuel down to Bethlehem, and he finds David, who is the youngest of, I think, 7 brothers. So if any of you are the youngest child, you know that as the youngest child, you don't get to decide what games to play among the kids. You don't get to lead among your siblings. You're always the youngest to tag along. Youngest children don't tend to grow up to be leaders. I remember reading one time about the Apollo 11 astronauts. Every single one of them was a firstborn child. And that tends to be true of people doing leadership roles, big heroic things. They tend to be firstborns because firstborns tend to get more responsibility put on them earlier. David, of course, is not that guy. And yet David's the one that God selected. Samuel looked at all of his brothers, and they all looked big, strong, handsome men that looked like they ought to be a king. And God said to Samuel, let's see, he said to Samuel in verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So God's told Samuel already, there's 2 things I'm looking for in my next king. 1, he's going to be a man after my own heart, and 2, I look at the heart. I don't look at what he looks like, I don't look at what he does, I look at his heart. So he selects David. And Samuel anoints him as king, but he doesn't make him king. He just anoints him as king, which means someday you're going to be king, but not yet. In chapter 17, the first time that David really does anything, and we can make some sort of judgment about his character. This is the famous story of the fight between David and Goliath. Again, we've got the Philistines coming. They are the big enemy of the Israelites. And this time, they come out, they get their army together, Saul gets his army together, and they're all going to fight. And wait. Maybe we shouldn't have everybody fight. Philistines make a suggestion. We have here one of our soldiers. Let's have him come out, and you guys pick one of your soldiers, and we'll have the 2 of them fight, and whoever wins this one-on-one fight, that'll win the battle. And that way we don't have to have this great big battle with lots of people dying. We'll just have the 2 guys do it. And oh, by the way, our champion is 9 feet tall. And he's got armor that covers him from shoulder to knees, and he's got a big helmet, and he's got a spear that's so big that a normal man can't lift it. That's our champion. Doesn't this sound like a great idea? Well, they make this challenge. And the Israelites are not stupid. Like I said, most of them are just farmers and other sorts of people who aren't soldiers. And they look at this guy that's 9 feet tall. I'm not going to go fight that guy. And so the champion, Goliath, comes out, and for 40 days, he stands there and says, "Come and fight me!" And the Israelites say, nobody comes out. Nobody comes out. Nobody comes out. Nobody comes out. One day, David comes to visit his brothers. He's not in the army. Probably too young to be in the army. And he comes to visit his brothers. And to bring them some food and generally take care of them. And he hears this challenge from Goliath. And David, he's down there and he's watching him come by. He talks to the soldiers and he says, in verse 26 of chapter 17, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Saul has made some promises. If a guy kills Goliath, I'll give him my daughter. His family won't have to pay taxes. I'll give him all these riches and glory and honor. And so they tell him. And David's puzzled. Now, first thing we see about David is he doesn't look at Goliath and say, oh my goodness, that guy is 9 feet tall. I can't fight him. He looks at Goliath and says, no. What's going to happen if somebody kills him? So he asks that question. And Saul hears about David. Saul hasn't had anybody even ask a question about Saul. So he calls David. Come here and talk to me, young man. And David says to Saul, in verse 32, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now, not all of the guys around Saul are farmers. Some of them are people that he has selected to be with him all the time, to be professional soldiers. Saul himself has fought in a number of battles. So he's not lacking for men with courage, but none of them has said, I'll go fight the Philistine, not even Saul himself. And here's David, who's probably somewhere between 18 to 20 years old, and he says, I'll go fight him. Saul says, you can't go fight him. You're not able to go fight this Philistine. You are but a youth. Well, he has been a warrior from his youth. David says to Saul, pay attention to David's character and what this shows about him. Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him, attacked him, rescued it from his mouth. When he rose up against me, I seized him by the beard, struck him, and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. David is a man hurt. He's got heart. David says, yeah, that guy's big and tall, but I can take him. And I can take him. What I like about David, he's not reckless about it. He doesn't say, I can take him because, hey, I'm 18, I can beat him. He doesn't just think he can beat him. He says, you know what? I have fought with bears. I've fought with lions. If I can handle them, I can handle a soldier that's 8 feet tall. Saul's a little skeptical, but, well, he hasn't gotten any volunteers, so he agrees, okay, fine. You can take him on. And so David goes out and to meet Goliath. Goliath sees a soldier from the Israelites coming and goes to meet him. And here's the kid. And you don't even have proper armor. You don't have a sword. You don't have a spear. You've got a sling and a stick. This is insulting to Goliath. What on earth are these Israelites doing? And he starts to mock him and taunt him. Kid, I am going to rip your guts out, basically. David says, verse 45, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. I will strike you down and remove your head from you. Give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky, the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That all this assembly may know the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's. He will give you into our hands. Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle lines to meet the Philistine. David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it. Struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone stank into his forehead, so he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. When you watch the movies, and sometimes they have these single combat bats in the movie, and it goes on for a long time. Because you got to make it look like they're about equal, because it's not much of a fight otherwise. And they go on and they fight, and usually the good guy, is losing at the beginning, because that makes it better if he wins eventually. And he gets beat up by the other guy, and he just, at the beginning, it doesn't look like he's doing so well. And then somehow he manages to bring it all back together, and he kills the bad guy. But this fight, this big fight that they've been not looking forward to if you're an Israelite for the last 40 days. The one that's going to settle this whole battle lasts, what, about 30 seconds? Goliath, he's got all the armor, he's got the spear, I'm going to kill you. And David says, I got a better idea. I'm going to take my sling. You would think that a sling is overmatched by sword and spear and all that sort of thing. But the sling that he's using, it's not a slingshot, first of all. I used to remember when I was a kid, I thought that's what it was. Not a slingshot. It's a big piece of leather about 6 feet long or so. It's got a little pouch in the middle, so you put a rock there in the middle, and then you double it over so you're holding it like this. The rock that you put in there is not a little pebble. It's about the size of a tennis ball. So you put a rock in there, and then you sling it, or you swing it like this with your arm, and you let go of one of those leather straps as you come up about right here or so, and you can sling that stone. Basically, it's turning your arm into a catapult. And when you sling that stone, if you're practiced at it, it is flying at about 60 miles an hour. And they said of some of the slingers from Benjamin that they could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. That's the kind of skill that David has with his stone. So when you put it that way, it's not so surprising that he won. Goliath was expecting him to come with a sword and a shield, and he would have won that kind of battle, I'm pretty sure. But David used his sling. He attacked him in a way that Goliath did not expect, and hit him right between the eyes with that sling stone, just exactly where David meant to, and Goliath fell down dead. So David won this battle for 2 reasons. He went in saying, I'm confident in God. But it wasn't a reckless sort of confidence where I don't know what I'm going to do, but God's going to take care of me, so I'm going to go fight the Philistines. David said, I'm confident in God, and I have a plan. I know how to use my weapons. I'm not going to, Saul offered to loan him his sword and shield, but David said, no, I'm not familiar with those. I'm going to use my own weapons. And I'm going to find where Goliath is weak. However, he was wearing his helmet. It didn't cover a vulnerable spot here. And I'm going to hit him there, and I'm going to kill him. He did. So he was depending on God, and he was confident in himself. He put the two things together in order to win this battle. There's lots more we could say about David. I spent a whole class, and we took like 6 months going over David. There's tons of things we can learn about David. But the second thing I want to point out about David's character comes from chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. David is king of Israel now. He's had lots of adventures and finally became king. And now, something like about 10 years into his reign as king. So he's been king for a while. There's probably the greatest military crisis of his reign, where Israel has been attacked simultaneously by 3 different nations, which are more or less allied together. And this is the second year of this war. And so David has sent Joab, the commander of his army, sent his army up to resume the campaign, because they don't fight in the wintertime. This is springtime. And he's staying in Jerusalem, probably to coordinate the war, because we've got so many different people that we have to fight. And he stays there. But unlike last year, this year it starts out kind of quiet, and David gets bored. And so, verse 2 of chapter 11. When evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around the roof of the king's house. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful in appearance. I got to skip through the story a little bit and summarize it, so we can do this in time. But David sees a woman bathing, calls her up to the palace, makes her spend the night with him. Turns out that, well, obviously that would be wrong because he's not married to her. And he's married to other women himself, so that's adultery on David's part. But even worse than that, it turns out that she's married too. And not to just any common guy. She's married to one of David's elite soldiers. One of his own men. One of the soldiers who is up there fighting in that campaign that he just sent the army out. That's pretty bad. And then she sends him a message and says, "Oh, I'm pregnant, by the way." So things are just getting worse and worse for David. Now, not only has he got to hide the adultery, he's got to do something about the baby. She's going to get pregnant. Her husband's going to come home. He's going to know, I haven't been here in the last 6 months. Wife, how come you're pregnant? And she's going to say, well, King David asked me to come to the palace. That's a problem for David, right? How are we going to hide this? And so David comes up with a plan. He calls the husband back home. Why don't you give me a report on the war? And David's thinking, great, he'll give me a report, and then he'll go home and he'll sleep with his wife and he'll think the child's his and nobody will ever know and everything will be great. But the soldier, his name is Uriah, doesn't go home. He sleeps that night there in the palace with the rest of the soldiers. David calls him in the next morning. How come you didn't go home? And Uriah says, we should go read this because it is such a good response. Uriah says in verse 11, "My lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? By your life and by the life of your soul, I will not do this thing. My comrades are up there camping in tents, and it's windy, and they're hungry, and tent life is not particularly good. I am so loyal. I'm such a good soldier that I'm not going to go home and take a shower and live in my house and spend the night with my wife while all the rest of them can't. That's how good of a soldier he is. That's how loyal and just so devoted to duty. And David's like, not how you're supposed to respond. You're supposed to go and be with your wife so that you can hide the things. David's got to come up with another plan. So he does. He writes a message to his commander, Joab. He says to Joab, take Uriah, put him in the hottest spot of the battle, and then pull back so that the enemy soldiers. And then you know what he does? He rolls that letter up and seals it, and he hands it to Uriah. He says, go take that, Joab. I got a message. He sends the death warrant by the hand of the accused man, of the condemned man. Is that despicable or what? So he sends the order up there. Joab's a good commander. He does what he's told. And Uriah dies. Killed. David gets the message. Uriah is dead. David says, oh, that's too bad. But hey, now I can go marry Bathsheba, the wife, and now everybody will think that the baby's mine and everything will be fine. And that's too bad about Uriah. Stuff happens. War happens. People die at that. Now, remember what God said back at the beginning? He said to Saul, and Saul didn't go killing his own men. Saul didn't go sleeping with the wives of his soldiers. Saul just made a sacrifice when he wasn't supposed to. God said, I can't have that. You are not going to be king anymore. I'm going to have a man after my own heart. And the man after God's own heart turns out, well, he is a courageous man that can kill Goliath. He's also a man that can rape his own soldier's wife and then murder the soldier to cover it up. How can David be a man after God's own heart again? That just doesn't follow, does it? David is a man of great courage and strength and character, a man of great philosophy, a man who can murder. And I think actually this kind of murder is worse than, he didn't even kill by his own hand. He sent the message and had somebody else do it for him. And then a whole year goes by before God finally confronts David. And God says to David, I know what you did. I know that you killed Uriah. And here, I think, is the difference between David and Saul. Saul's sin wasn't as great, but when he was confronted by Samuel, Saul's response was, well, I had to do it, and, I forced myself. When David's sin was a lot greater. When God sent Nathan, the prophet, Nathan comes and tells him that God lives. And David's response in verse 13 of chapter 12. David said, I have sinned against the Lord. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain it away. He didn't try to, any of the things that Saul did, in other words. He just, I have sinned. He took responsibility for having that. Probably don't have time this morning, but look at Psalms chapter 51 when you get home. Psalm 51 is a psalm that David wrote after this, after he was found out. And as you read through Psalm 51, you can see from what David says that despite all that sin that he did, the horribleness of that crime, of that sin, in Psalm chapter 51, he feels it. And he is fully and genuinely repentant. And he says, please, God, forgive me. Don't take your blessing away from me. Please. That's what he says to God. And that is the difference between David and Saul. David sinned greater. He did worse, actually. And yet, God called him the man after my own heart, because when David was caught doing wrong, David accepted responsibility, unlike Saul, and David fully repented. So much more we could say about David. But I think those two events demonstrate who David was. David was a man of tremendous courage, tremendous faith. He believed that God was going to be there with him so that he could beat that giant. A man of tremendous leadership ability. We didn't talk about it, but David had a knack of getting people to follow him. And had so much going for him. He's also a man of tremendous flaws. A man who could kill in cold blood just to hide his own sin. But despite all of that, God called him a man after my own heart, because David tried to do the right thing, and when he didn't, he repented and did whatever he could to make it right. And God forgave him, not because of the good things he did, but because he truly repented, unlike Saul. That's why God can say, David is a man after my own heart. So, the thing for us to learn is, it'd be nice if we never sinned. It'd be nice if we gave ourselves to God and God kept us from sinning. God gave us whatever moral strength so that we could avoid temptation and resist it. God doesn't do that. He didn't do it for David. He's not going to do it for us. The difference for us is, what do we do? What do we do when we're caught in sin? Do we make excuses like Saul did? Or do we accept responsibility and humble ourselves before God like David did, asking for forgiveness?